This is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tara Genji tradition video. This video will continue the Kumazawa Banzan series. This is part 2 of the Daigaku Wakumon series. Part 1 addressed the first 3 chapters of the text. This video, which is part 2, will address chapter 4. Now, fair warning, chapter 4 includes or involves economics. Now, economics is a boring topic for some people. Economics is a sensitive topic for some people as well, especially this video is being made in 2022, and the political climate currently is one where economics is a bit of an issue. So there's a lot of very strong thoughts and feelings about economics. So I just wanted to warn the viewer of the following. Okay, Jinsei, which is the key factor in Kumazawa Banzan's ideology, it does support some practices which are politically divisive at the time because of a lot of the economic crisis, with people having very strong, very stark opinions about economics. Some of the things, I just want to warn some of the viewers that, some ideas may be presented that they may not like. However, so you, the viewer, may or may not agree with Banzan's economics ideas, but you should remember the following: that essentially, basically, Kumazawa Banzan is discussing the economic realities of the late 1600s in Japan. At this time, it's an irrefutable historical fact that Japan was suffering serious economic issues at the hands of the seemingly incompetent Tokugawa shogunate. Now, the Tokugawa shogunate was extremely draconian here, and as we will discuss repeatedly over and over in the Kumazawa series, the Tokugawa shogunate always favored inefficiency for the sake of maintenance of power. And we'll talk about why, and in the previous videos we basically said that's not Jinsei, and that was one of the key reasons why the Tokugawa shogunate is a failure, because always choosing inefficiency to maintain its own power. But again, and also for anyone who's very much in love with the Tokugawa shogunate, fair warning as well, because these videos are highly critical of the Tokugawa shogunate. So with that having been said, let's look at chapter 4. So chapter 4 is about the fundamentals of large projects or large activities that one can engage in to grow wealth and at the same time prevent waste. So it opens with the question of how and why does one grow wealth and prevent waste? Why would you do it? What are the methods, etc., etc.? And the quick answer is that Jinsei cannot happen without great resources. So the reason that you would grow your wealth and prevent waste, the reason why this is a key chapter, why it's its own specific, we have to talk about this directly and very specifically, is because a compassionate government cannot function without great resources. So compassion must have the means to enact its intention. So a quote from there is in the present day, late 1600s Japan, there are many without a means of sustenance and subsistence and support. They have no family, no mother, father, children, etc., who can support them. So what this is late 1600s Japan, and you had a lot of people that were in dire economic straits. Kumazawa then teaches directly that Jinsei dictates that the government must start with the poorest people first. Now I know in 2022 this is kind of a divisive topic, because a lot of people are very sensitive about spending money on the poorest people, right? There's the idea of giving money to reduce poverty or doing welfare or giving assistance and things like that is a very decisive topic. But this is what Jinsei teaches. You have to, Jinsei teaches that you have to support, you have to hold up even the lowest of the low. Specifically in the actual case of this text, what he is talking about is, and the quote says, "At present, this problem seems most apparent among the Ronin, with innumerable cases of Ronin starving to death." The document then goes on for about a paragraph or so explaining how starvation, not just among the Ronin, but also among the commoners, was picking up around the country. Now, it mentions, the Ronin, it mentions the sort of Goshi, it mentions these sort of peasants of samurai stock. There's different social categories ranging from samurai to half samurai to was once samurai, then to just straight up commoners. There's this kind of all mentioned clumped in there, but it gives a discussion about how they are how poverty is picking up around the country, and not just people don't have enough money to entertain themselves, but people are starving to death. Now, let's unpack this a little bit step by step so that you understand what's taking place better and what Kumazawa is actually trying to explain and teach. So, again, point number one, yes, Kumazawa is saying that Jinsei is required to provide public support to the people, to poor commoners and poor samurai. Jinsei teaches that you must govern and protect all under heaven. If you isolate a particular group of people and say, forget them, they can suffer, this 15-20% of the population can be sacrificed for the other 80%. We're not, basically, we should not waste any money upholding the poorest portion of the population. Screw them, let them starve. Let's put the resources into the higher portion of the population. That is not Jinsei. And according to the teachings, you are building a reason for heaven to punish you. The kind of ideology where you would cut off a portion of society and just forget about them, just sacrifice them for the sake of the other portion. So in other words, refusing to take care of the impoverished section of society so that the middle and the richer portion of society can, not have to share its wealth. That will bring about heaven's wrath, according to Confucianism, etc., etc. All under heaven means all under heaven, and we've discussed this a little bit because Kusanokiryu also has this same teaching. So this is taught by Kumazawa Banzan, but it is also found in Confucianism, but it is also found in old Chinese classics. It's also found in the Southern Court ideology as well. It's a very key point. All under heaven means everybody, not just the people you like, everybody. So, simply put, Jinsei requires the leaders to care for all of society, not just select part of society. Now let's move on to the second part of unpacking this, the second point. Let's see how this is playing out in the late 1600s Japan. This is what now the principle of Jinsei was point one, but now let's look at what Kumazawa is actually directly talking about in his actual text, in the actual context of the actual time period. The Tokugawa shogunate at this time, pretty much through its entire existence, consistently implement terrible government, just inefficient, terrible policies for the sake of suppressing retainers and the general population. Now, we're all familiar with the Tokugawa shogunate being very draconian, being very harsh, and being just having those issues, but it's always usually considered within the context of punishing crimes and military tribunal type stuff. But this actually applies across the board, even outside of, punishing crimes and military sort of tribunals. This gets into every category, including economics. So basically, the Tokugawa shogunate has poor economic policy for the purpose of suppressing the retainers and the common people. For example, the shogunate deliberately keeps the daimyo in a state of financial hardship, taxing the daimyo and forcing them to spend money that is ultimately more than they make. So look at the letters in red, because this is something that not a lot of people will talk about, but this is a critical point in understanding Tokugawa period economics and power structures. The daimyo were constantly in debt. Again, the daimyo were constantly in debt. This state of constant debt was a deliberate creation by the shogunate because it suppressed the daimyo's abilities. Or in short, the daimyo can't raise an army to rebel against the shogunate if they can't pay for that army. However, this debt does not only neuter the daimyo, but it trickles down and harms the retainers and the common people. Retainers get fired because daimyo can no longer support them, and then those retainers end up as ronin who can't find work, who end up starving to death, or end up committing crimes, which then, crimes against who? Other ronin or the common people, etc. So, it causes poverty to increase, it causes crime to increase. Commoners go without resources, daimyo aren't able to support agricultural projects, they're not able to fix dams and levees, they're not able to do things, etc., etc. Everybody suffers. Now the text goes on to say, even if the shogun's vaults were emptied completely, there would not be enough to cover the amount of debt. That's a quote straight from the text. And the key point of that is that the Tokugawa shogunate again creates a system which plunges the daimyo into an inescapable debt, and this is to keep them in control and suppressed, and that debt then harms the retainers and the common people. The shogunate doesn't care about them, it only cares about staying in power. The Tokugawa shogunate is a highly inefficient government in which the people are suffering, and that suffering is in exchange for the Tokugawa shoguns to be in control. So the problem here is that the purpose of government is not to be a business. But so the Tokugawa shoguns are treating the government like their own personal business, doing, whatever to just keep in charge, right? But that's not the purpose of government. The purpose of government is to provide an efficient and functional means to maintain all under heaven. So, all right, now let's move on. That's the principle. Now, hopefully that makes sense. Now, let's go to the next slide. So let's unpack that last bit just a little more. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over these 2 points that you see on your screen and this is a summation of these aren't direct quotes, these are more summation points to streamline and make this easier. So the first point can be summarized in that government is not a private for-profit business. Jinsei should be efficient, but there are times when wealth must be spent on the welfare of citizens when there is not going to be any profit made from that wealth that is spent. In other words, the return on investment is not going to be cash or wealth, but it is the health and happiness of the citizens. So this is a critical point. Jinsei dictates that government is not a for-profit business. You will spend resources, cash, wealth, etc., and not get anything back for it other than healthy and happy citizens, because that's the goal of government. Healthy, happy, productive citizens, not profit. The second point is that the samurai, or any military or military industrial group, cannot be allowed to be the government. So in red, this is a key point. This exact point is also taught in the Jino Shotoki, where the Southern Court teachings remind the samurai that the samurai's place is service to the emperor, not control of the country. The military or the samurai which I will make a video in the future sort of looking at examining that. But for the most part, the samurai, the military, the security force, however you want to conceive of it, they're the fierce fangs and teeth of the emperor. They are who the emperor gets to go put foot to ass when the emperor needs to get aggressive. But they can never be the rulers themselves. And this is pretty much the failure of the Tokugawa shogunate, because we see a very selfish samurai family, the Tokugawa, sacrificing the stability of the people in a very us versus them mentality, right? So it's good for that kind of us versus them mentality is good for war, but it is terrible for government. Consequently, this is also the exact same issue with the Hojo shoguns and the Ashikaga shoguns, both challenging the sovereignty of the emperor. But the next video, I'm going to make a video that will discuss this some more. But this second point on here, this is a key point here. The samurai being the leaders of the country is a terrible idea, because the samurai's purpose is to fight. That is not the purpose of government. Kumazawa goes on and writes that the most immediate solution to this 1600s crisis in Japan, of this economic crisis, is for the government first and foremost to recognize that service to all under heaven is the purpose of the government, and that the purpose of the government is not to maintain power at all cost. And he suggests a series of strategies and ideas to spread the wealth so that society can function at a healthy level. He says, as an example, like one of the quotes is, "Let the carpenter afford his materials and tools without going into debt." So then the question is presented, these teachings have existed since ancient times. Why do current governments not put these teachings into practice? And the answer given is that in order for something to manifest, you need the correct time, the correct place, and the correct circumstances. And he concludes that the Tokugawa shogunate simply lacks these three, and that it's not possible for the Tokugawa shogunate to thus implement these correctly. The Tokugawa shoguns essentially lack insight and wisdom. They lack the circumstances. And so, in short, they're not fit to be leaders. So the time and place is not the issue. The issue is the circumstance or the status or ability. And they just do not have. There's nothing wrong with the time period to implement the practices. There's nothing wrong with the place. The fault lies entirely on the Tokugawa shogunate's lack of circumstance or lack of ability. So, in short, it's the Tokugawa shogun's fault for not implementing this. The next question, what changes could be put into effect right now in order to see an increase in wealth and a prevention of loss? And then the question says, use rice as an example. Because we are talking about 1600 Japan, and rice is an economic factor, right? So Kumazawa writes that essentially far too much rice is wasted and thrown away. Fixing this single issue alone would significantly boost the wealth of the country. However, the daimyo are not allowed to make such changes on their own. The changes would have to be put into effect by the shogunate. The shogun would have to choose to fix these issues and allow these changes to take place, but they won't. So again, it's the consistently poor policies put in place to suppress the daimyo that are the problem. The solutions are actually fairly simple. The shoguns just won't do it because the shoguns have committed themselves to suppressing, they've committed themselves to inefficient government for the purpose of suppressing potential usurping of themselves. But if one were to make some changes, it then goes into some very specific very specific things, like, for example, build decent storehouses and spend money on flood protection. like building levees and things like that. The shogunate was incredibly restrictive with allowing people to repair and develop infrastructure. So simply, repairing the granaries, building better granaries, building flood protection, repairing the current falling apart flood protections. That would be a major deal. Stop using hulled rice for taxes. They used to use unhulled rice for taxes, but then the government decided to enforce them to use hulled rice. But the problem with hulled rice is bugs and insects and infestation is an issue with hulled rice. So a lot of rice would get collected for taxes, and then a lot of it would just get infested and go and be useless. Stop growing excess crops and simply grow more rice. So for example, stop growing so much of things that are in excess. There's an excess amount of this crop, an excess amount of that crop, and it's just sitting there gathering dust or going bad. Like, in other words, manage the fields better. When you have too much of a certain crop, stop growing that much crop and simply grow more rice instead. Now here in red, this is a key point. Two key points that goes into the next slide. Too much rice is being circulated and kept in port cities like Osaka. Not enough is circulating and being kept inland. So on the coast, there's way too much rice. And on the interior, there's far too little rice. It's ridiculous. And then the biggest one is that there's no consistent value of rice. So the shogunate should set a standard. Now this is a huge issue at the time because, for example, with the port cities, if you have too much rice piling up in Osaka, the value of rice drops, right? On the coast, they're like, well, we have way too much rice. Rice is worth less now. The price of rice drops, right? But the inland towns end up having to pay more for rice because on the coast rice is cheap. But in order to then get that rice from the coast into the inland, well then that is where people start jacking the prices up because now they got to pay for it to be shipped inland, and we got to pay the driver, and we got to pay for the oxen, and we got to pay this, and we got to pay this. And then the people who grow the rice inland, and then the rice gets shipped to the coast, and then they are paying higher prices for the rice to be shipped back to them inland, even though on the coast rice is losing its value. So it's a problem. So then the text goes on to say, well, question, what about gold and silver? Should we abandon gold and silver and just focus on rice? And Kumazawa answers no. Keep them as they are. Keep gold and silver in place. That way you'll have rice, gold, and silver as currency, and that's fine as long as there's a consistent administration of the value. So then that naturally leads to the question of, okay, well, how much should rice cost? Which this in red, this is setting the standard. And Kumazawa says, at the time of this writing, 1 koku of rice should be 50 mei, which mei is a type of unit, 50 mei of silver. So 1 koku equals 50 units of silver. Now understandably, and then he says, understandably, this value will need to be monitored and adjusted with caution and with wisdom, in the future. But there should be a standard, and even though it has to be tweaked and adjusted, it should relatively be close to this. And if the shogun would simply set a standard to the value of rice, it would begin to fix a lot of the economic issues in late 1600s Japan. So let's go ahead and sum this up and bring this video to a close. It's a little longer than I wanted it to be, but it is what it is. Jinsei teaches that the government is there to maintain an orderly and productive society. It is not a for-profit business venture, and it is not meant to be a draconian military unit. Jinsei requires that the leaders to not leave out any group of society. You're not allowed to pick and choose which parts of society you'll lead and serve and help. You have to include everyone. You have to include all under heaven. The Tokugawa shogunate forced the daimyo lords into a state of constant debt and economic instability, which caused hardship on their retainers and the common citizens. This means that the Tokugawa shogunate does not understand and or does not practice jinsei. The Tokugawa shogunate also supports economic disasters, such as the instability of rice production, the value of rice, and the distribution of rice, again harming the samurai and the commoners, for the purpose of suppressing the population, hurting the population for the purpose of keeping power. This is not jinsei. And then basically then like I said, Kumazawa suggests a list of reasonable adjustments in order to fix some of these key biggest issues. All right, that's the end of this section of this chapter. And that is it for this video. As always, these videos are meant to be brief, and they are meant to inspire you or to give you a starting off point. The material in this video is copywritten by me, so please do not steal this material. Please do not take it. Please do not copy it. Again, I hope it inspires you. I hope that it sets you off on your own investigations and explorations.